Hi, friends, and welcome to the Objective Hindu. Today, I want to talk to you about the proposed changes to the FCRA rules and legislation in India. So, FCRA, that stands for the Foreign Contributions Regulations Act. And this is a more detailed video, so I probably spend like 20 to 30 minutes perhaps going through the intricacies of what's going on and give you my analysis on why I think it's a really good measure and why some of the criticism is extremely misplaced, if not cynical. So that's the agenda, and I'll go through one section at a time. So I want to start off with just setting the lay, right? So what exactly is going on? So firstly, we already have India that is already has an FCRA Act. This was enacted in 2010, and this was enacted by the previous government, so the Congress-led UPA government. And it's already a fairly potent law, and if you want to put it in other words, it's a fairly strict law, and it does a lot of the things that the changes are seeking to improve on. So the framework kind of already exists, but it's got some gaps, which is what we look at in a second. But the law already exists. Then there's the rules. So for any legislation, the government can issue rules via a gazette notification. So they can change the rules from time to time. For example, which forms need to be filled, what the prescribed forms are, etc. Right? So in June this year, the government has notified a new set of rules, and these rules are already in effect. And I'll tell you what those rules are and what they do. Okay. So, but these rules, it's very important to understand, are tied to the existing amendment. So they are operational, but within the limitations of obviously what the existing law says. Then you have the amendment bill, which is seeking to change the law, which has been tabled in Parliament earlier this year, and it's scheduled to be discussed, I think, tomorrow actually. So good timing as far as this video is concerned. So that's the FCRA amendment bill. So we'll look at all these three in some detail, right? So these are the three legislative sort of instruments, two are laws and one's a set of rules. I suspect that if the amendments pass the parliament, there will be a new set of rules as well, because the existing rules that have been notified in June can obviously only be based on the legal framework that the 2010 Act provides, which, as you will now see, is actually already quite potent, but has some important gaps. So let's first start with the global context. So I live in Australia, I've lived in other parts of the world, and the key point I want to make here in this sort of segment is that regulating money, firstly, internal or external, and certainly foreign source of funds, is a very common concept, and it already exists in most advanced economies. Like I said, it already exists in India too, with the existing laws. But as an example, the FATF regulations, you might have heard that sometimes Pakistan is on the grey list of FATF, etc., from a terror funding perspective, or the AUSTRAC regulations in Australia, and there are many more in the European Union, etc. What they try and do is essentially something very similar. They try and figure out where the money is coming from, who's sending it, why they're sending it, and who's receiving it. And often what happens is that money that is being used for ulterior motives, not just in an NGO context, but think about terror financing or hawala and rackets, etc., and tax evasion. These are routed through all these sort of foreign channels, and there's layers and layers of shell companies that you try and to hide your identity. So the idea that you want to regulate and ensure a degree of transparency for anything that has firstly for anything domestic, but that already exists in the banking system, and then anything international, especially when there's foreign funding involved, is a well-established principle, right? In fact, FATF specifically states that for foreign funded donations into NGOs, there's additional scrutiny. For example, who the money actually goes to, and I'll explain this concept of a beneficial owner in a second. So, long story short, this is a well-established global precedent. Obviously, it already exists in India to some extent, and all we are doing now, as I think the government should do, is give it a little bit more teeth and give it a slightly better structure to adopt to the changing times. Because, for example, some of these laws and regulations don't really work very well in the age of digital transfers and certainly in the age of cryptocurrency, etc. So in some ways, the laws are trying to catch up all the time with changes to technology, but also changes to sophistication from a bad actor perspective. Then moving on to the existing law, so the FCRA 2010 Act, this is actually already quite a potent legislation. And I've read the legislation as well as the other two. And I can tell you that it's actually already quite, in quotes, strict. So those who are accusing the current dispensation, BJP, of being, in quotes, hard on charities and foreign funded sort of organizations, please note that the existing FCRA law is equally strict. And the problem is not with the law. The problem is that the law is light on details. So, for example, the law already has limitations on what sort of purpose you might want to receive or you're allowed to receive foreign funding for. But where it falls short, as an example, is that it doesn't list exhaustively the purposes that the government or India is okay with. And there's no mechanism by which that list can be changed from time to time, for example. Another example of a gap in the current law is that it does talk about for an FCRA registration and certificates, but it's not very detailed on what happens if your registration either ceases or has been suspended. Right? Both those provisions exist, but it's light on details in terms of the implementation. So what happens to that? What's the process to be followed from an NGO perspective in case your registration has been suspended, and also from a governmental perspective in case that the government is actually suspending someone's registration. So who are the authorities? What are the processes? It's light on those details. So the sort of regulatory framework is not as detailed as it needs to be in the context of 2026. But what I want to say is that the law in its letter and in its spirit, because I was doing some research on this video and I was told that more than 5,000 NGOs have been suspended under the existing law, under the UPA regime. So this goes to say that it's not like there's some, scheme that the NDA government is coming up with, which is fundamentally different. Even when there were like protests, and you might remember, Indians might remember that there were these protests against the power plant in Kudanakulam in Kerala, the nuclear power plant, or the Sterlite industry protests. Or more recently, the PFI funding saga, or this guy Zakir Naik's organization. Although I think some of that happened during the BJP era, but it was still caught under the ambit of the existing law and regulations, right? So again, just to stress this point, the law exists and it has been utilized, but it's light on. It lacks a little bit of teeth. Let's put it that way. And the details matter. Now, moving on to the rules. Now, this is where it becomes really interesting. So on the 22nd of June, via a Gazette notification, the government amended the rules, or actually laid out a new set of rules that are already in effect. So this is very important. These rules are already in effect with or without the new amendments that are pending in Parliament, right? Now, these rules do many things, and I'll tell you what they are briefly in a second. But these rules are utilizing the existing framework, and they're created under that framework. So the existing 2010 Act allows the government to come up with rules. And this is very common in all laws, right? So the Citizenship Amendment Act or the Waqf Amendment Act, they all also had accompanying rules. And that's where actually the details emerge, right? The legislation usually just creates a little bit of a sort of framework, and then you have to read the rules to know what's going on. So what are some of these rules? So firstly, I briefly mentioned that the existing sort of legislation and the older rules do specify a purpose, but there's no details. So this new rules, new set of rules that have been notified, now have a very explicit list of allowed activities, right? And I actually have the Gazette notification here. So if you'd allow me to look away from you for a second, it's a very long list of activities that are permitted, and I'll tell you what's not permitted as well. So you could have a lot. This is Schedule 9, right? Oh, sorry, this is Schedule 6 in the Gazette. And so you've got a list of religious activities. You can construct mosques. You can preserve your records. You can, you can do theological research. You can set up dharamshalas, langars, or community kitchens, blah, 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 blah. You've got a set of cultural activities, archaeological exploration, linguistic preservation, all sorts of things within the cultural ambit. Then again, you've got economic activities. Remember, NGOs are not just religious NGOs, right? There are all sorts of other NGOs like educational NGOs, etc., or NGOs that are trying to uplift the poor, and there are some genuine ones. So there's a list of economic activities that are permissible as well. Then there are educational activities. Again, there's a long list of things that you can do. And some of these were implied before these rules were notified, but now the government has specifically gone ahead and listed them, right? Literally one by one. And you'll see why it needs to be done. It needs to be done because without these rules, then you can't administer the rules. So this is a long list of activities here, and if you're interested in the description to the in this video, I'll actually add a direct link to the Gazette notification so you can read it firsthand. Now, all the hue and cry about these rules is about a couple of exclusions, right? And so the only two exclusions that I'm reading for you here is excluding proselytization. So you can do preservation and support of religious and theological institutions, religious history, blah, 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 blah. In brackets, it says excluding proselytization. So that's one sort of, exception there. And then there's a section there that talks about any anti-national activities. Now, like that's, obviously no sovereign country is going to allow money that comes from outside. Well, firstly, money that comes from within the country as well, but that's regulated through other mechanisms. So this is specifically about what happens when people who are sending the money are not governed by Indian law, at least before these amendments are passed. So this is all about, protecting the country and making sure that whatever is in quotes considered anti-national activities. Now, what's considered anti-national activity? Well, that is just in line with our existing legislation, right? So if it's sedition, if it's promoting religious disharmony, these are existing, these would fall or be caught under the existing laws when it comes to anti-national activities, right? So if you're doing terror financing, now, if you've got nothing to do with a foreign organization, it's still an anti-national activity. But then that is covered, and the funding that you might have received for a terror operation is covered under domestic legislation, right? So a lot of this happens in Kashmir, for example, and a lot of that has been successfully stopped now. But this now specifically says that similar rules will apply for foreign funded organizations as well, right? Now we come to this key point around proselytization, and I'll actually come back to this at the end of the video and explain this in a little bit more detail. But very briefly, think about it this way, that our constitution guarantees the right of the freedom of religion, includes the right to propagate your religion. So the government actually cannot, now I have a very strong view on this, but the government actually can't stop you from, in quotes, converting people, right? You can still do that. What this rule will do is that it will prevent, and you will hear people say, inducement and giving people money, etc. Even that is very hard to prove in court. So basically what the government is saying is, it's just cutting off the source of that money, is in saying that you cannot send money to India with the specific purpose of converting people. This is different to saying that you can't convert people, because that the government can't say. But it's saying that you can't send money you basically can't receive money from overseas if you're an organization based in India. And you can't go to the government and say that I've got this $1 million and it's come from some Baptist church in America and I'm going to be using that to convert people. You can't do that, right? And the way the government is preventing that is by including that in the list of unapproved activities, right? So you're stopping the money, not the activity. I want to repeat that. The government is stopping the flow of money into that activity, not the activity itself, because this can't stop the activity. There's a different path and a different challenge that would then entail, right? And I'll talk about proselytization in a second in some more detail, maybe at the end of the video. But these are the rules, and so this is an example. I'm just looking at some of the other key changes that these rules have made. So I think I've mentioned in one of the introductory remarks that You also now need to specify the geography. So for example, if your organization is based in India, where in India, and therefore if you want to open another sort of center, or let's say you're a church and you are a school and you want to open a second one in a different part of India, you now need permission to do that. So it's not like a blanket approval, it's a purpose specific and geography specific approval. Then you've got there are a couple of really interesting changes. One is this idea of a reasonable activity, and this is quite nuanced. So what used to happen is that people used to receive money and there was no way to actually ensure whether that money was even being used for those purposes, right? So let's say previously you received money and you said it's for education, right? Firstly, this list of activities was not as detailed, like I mentioned. Secondly, how would you know whether that money is being used for education or not? There were no proper accounts and there was no threshold that was set by which we could assess that the money is actually being, in quotes, primarily used for education. So now what the rules state is that over a period of 2 years, if you've received money for a specific activity and that's what you've declared, well, you need to show that at least 10 lakh rupees, right? So 10 lakh rupees, which is, for foreign audiences around 18,000 Australian dollars, has been spent on that purpose, and this can be audited. So you can't just receive money and have it sitting idle or maybe use it for something else. You also need to show that you've spent the money on what you claim that it is for. So 10 lakh. So this is this idea of a reasonable activity. And then there's a very important addition, which is again in flight via these rules. And this is the concept of a key functionary. So what happens is that in anti-money laundering and KYC, know your customer or customer due diligence checks, which exists in financial institutions globally, there's the idea that you need to find out something called the beneficial owner. So who is the actual person who's benefiting on both sides? So who was the person who sent the money and who's the person who is actually controlling that money? And you can't get away with just saying that this organization has sent the money, or this organization or church as an NGO has received the money. You need to specify in much greater detail who the people/persons are, right? And so this is where the definition of a key functionary comes in. And then there are some specific rules around who can be a key functionary and also who can't be. Most importantly, a foreign national can now not be a key functionary of an organization, of one of these charitable organizations in India. This is important for two reasons. One is, again, it mimics this idea of a beneficial owner, if you're familiar with that concept in banking. And then secondly, it also brings those people within the ambit of Indian law. Because if that person's not of Indian, and let's say they're not even based in India, then it becomes very hard to prosecute them for any breach of civil or criminal sort of laws that exist in India, because then they unless you can extradite them, there's nothing you can do in many cases. So key functionary is a very key, a key functionary is a key addition to the rules, and think of it as ensuring that both sides, both the donator and the recipient, can always be identified. Right now, the key functionary is on the recipient side, not on the donation side. But through auditing and reporting requirements, we are trying to figure out who's sending the money. And on the recipient side, the key functionary has to be an Indian, and it needs to be an individual. It can't be a company or an entity. So you kind of know who the ultimate power/authority is. Last thing I will mention as far as the rules are concerned is, and it's linked to this AML and beneficial owner and sort of just financing regulations that I was explaining a little while earlier, is that there's now a lot of requirements on filing your returns in some ways. So you can consider them to be your financial returns, and there is a lot of specific scrutiny on making sure that you are declaring everything in a transparent manner to the government. Now, who do you declare it to? I'll come to that, because that requires changes to amendments, to the law via the amendments. But it would suffice to say that the rules now make it incumbent on any charitable organization. And again, I want to instead remind you that don't think of every charitable organization as a church or something, right? In fact, by some publicly available estimates, only 25%, now I'm saying only, it's a big amount, but only 25% of all foreign donations that come into India actually go into religious causes. So there are all sorts of other organizations, and they also need to follow these rules. And essentially, they're reporting guidelines, and they bring those organizations closer to what a company or an individual would have done ordinarily in India. So if you're making money in India, you would file your personal income taxes. If you're a company, you would be filing your corporate taxes, etc. Right? So it's something like that. And now there are very clearly documented guidelines around what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, and also when and to who you need to submit these details. Right? So these are the areas that the rules covers, and these are now in effect. Now let's move on to the law. That is the amendments to the law. So this is the FCRA amendment bill, which is now in Parliament and should be scheduled for a debate. Now, I don't expect the opposition to actually allow for any constructive debate, which is just another reminder of how hard it is for India to progress. Because to be honest, I've read the legislation in great detail. All it is doing is taking forward what the Congress government had put in place in 2010. So it's similar to the farm laws that were rescinded. It's another sad story of the Congress actually not following through on what it had started, right? And I'm happy to give them the credit because they started this. But anyway, now looking at the laws, or looking at the amendments to the law, there are, again, 4 or 5 things, right? The biggest thing is this key functionary. Now, this becomes a statutory requirement, right? So when the rules say that A, B, C, D, E can be a key functionary and this person can't be a key functionary, you still need legislative power to make that happen. So that will now happen through these amendments. So the amendments are required for that to be sort of given some sort of structure. And then linked to that is the idea of creating a designated authority. Now, this is very important, right? Previously, you could your funds could be seized, your registration certificate could be cancelled or suspended, but it was not very clear as to who deals with that. So there was no department of NGO affairs, if you want to put it that way, right? And so now there's this idea of a designated authority. So the law will now allows the government essentially to create a new body. It will be a statutory body. It won't be called the designated authority. All it's saying is that now the government can create an authority, and that authority will now be vested with the powers to oversee compliance, right? So for example, if your registration ceases for one of the many reasons that it could cease, for example, not just because you did something wrong. Let's say you just didn't apply in time for renewal. Well, what happens then? Someone's got to, look at your assets and what's happening with the money, and if you have any property, that will now all be with the designated authority. That will now be the job of the designated authority. So it's a little bit like a tribunal, if you want to look at it in a legal sense. So this designated authority now will have the powers to safeguard your assets, right? So firstly, the designated authority will be responsible for overall compliance. But for example, let's say you're a church and you fail to comply with these new regulations. Well, your certification will be, firstly, it will be suspended. It won't directly be cancelled. So it's not just a blank, check that is being issued to this designated authority. It is well thought through. So it will be suspended. And then there's obviously an appeals process via which within an X number of days, you can then resubmit for renewal or for lifting that suspension, and everything will be okay if you meet the requisite regulations. Or let's say you disappear, right? And this has also happened in many cases. People got some money, they set up something, and then those guys and girls or whoever have just vanished, right? And maybe they took the money. Now, in this case, the designated authority can firstly issue a secession certificate for that particular NGO or that registered organization. So that firstly states that, hey, you don't have a valid FCRA license anymore. And then it can provisionally take control of the assets, because this is very important. What happens to, and don't just think about this as money, right? It could be anything, right? Let's say there's a building there, a school. Well, now what's going to happen with that school if that organization that's running the school does not have the permission to operate that school anymore? So the designated authority can take over it, and it can deem what it needs to do with it. Now, again, there are lots of nuances to this particular part of the legislation. So it's not like the designated authorities in the business of running schools. So it will need to figure out a way to try and keep the school running. But in extreme cases, it can also dispose of assets. So obviously, a school's a bad example there. But let's say a bank account was seized, and let's say those people have been criminally prosecuted, and that registration has been cancelled irrevocably. Well, in that case, the government can seize the money, because that would be considered as illegal money. And then there'll be a sovereign fund that the central government will put in place, and that's where the money will be parked and used for national interest activities. Now, for those who are again criticizing, you might have heard that some bodies have criticized this whole designated authority idea. And I think it's overrated because they haven't read the law. But just as an example, let's say a church has been seized. When I say seized, it's not like seized with police, right? It's like the organization that runs it has lost its license to manage that organization using foreign funds, or that church using foreign funds. Now, in that case, the government can take control of that asset, which is in this case the church, but it cannot change the religious character. So the government can't say, I'm going to auction this church off to a private builder. It needs to maintain the character. So there are lots of safeguards in place, and this is just one example. But the previous law did not have this concept. So there was a gap there in terms of, like I said, the law lacked implementation details. It lacked the teeth. So the designated authority, think of it as a set of teeth for these particular laws, right? Or these particular amendments, I should say. And then one very important nuance I want to stress on is that now, so previously there could be civil penalties or a criminal penalty for flouting these regulations up to 5 years. Now that sentence, funnily, contrary to what you might have heard, has been reduced to up to 1 year. But there's not a catch. I was about to say there's a catch there. There's a nuance there. There's an improvement there. Previously, that could only be done, only those who had received the funds could be prosecuted, right? Because they are supposed to obviously make sure that those funds are received in accordance with the law. Now there is this additional responsibility on those who are utilizing that money. And this is very important. So for example, I receive money. So obviously I need to receive money and let the government know and, have the audits and the accounts in place. That's part one. That was partially already in place and it's been strengthened. But now let's say I give that money to you to build something. The new law now makes it incumbent on you to also to perform due diligence and not accept money that might be tainted. So for example, you might, if I'm giving you money, you can now request for my FCRA certificate, right? And you can now request for me to show you that I've filed my returns and all the financial documentation in line with the law before using my money. In fact, not only can you do it, you have to do it. Now, this is again very similar to the concepts that exist in banking, where, anyone who's receiving money as a corporation usually needs to perform some basic due diligence and make sure that that money is coming from a legitimate source. So let's say money came from Dawood Ibrahim, right? Which has happened obviously over the years in India. Well, obviously the person receiving the money has the first, job to be done there in terms of it's their duty of care to make sure that they don't take money from Dawood Ibrahim. But then if you took money from them, it's also your job to ensure that you've asked the right questions to that second person, that intermediary, right? So this is very important, and it spreads the duty of care across an additional party, and that party in this case is the utilizer of those funds, which might be different from the recipient of those funds. So this is a very welcome change, I would say, and just makes promoting this in our national interest from an accountability perspective a shared responsibility, and not just something that some authority needs to continuously monitor, right? It's your and my job to monitor it. That's the whole point. All right, we're kind of, I think we've covered the rules and legislation in a fair bit of detail. Now, I always say that if you're unsure about what happens, whether any proposed changes to Indian legislation is good or not, just identify what the great scholar Rajiv Malhotra has rightly called the Breaking India forces. So which are the forces that are antithetical to India and our development? Identify them, and then look at their reaction. So when Article 370 was removed or demobilized, so to say, from the Indian Constitution, I had a very simple question to those who did not understand the intricacies. What do you think is Pakistan's reaction? right? Now, if we can agree on the fact that Pakistan is an adversary, then all you need to do is look at their reaction and do the exact opposite of what they want you to do. Now, Pakistan wants 370 to be restored. Well, that is a very simple way to be certain that it should never be restored. The same logic can apply to these proposed changes, right? The Christian lobby in America, which is behind a lot of these fundings, especially the Baptists and the Pentecostals who believe in rabid proselytization and soul harvesting, they are already very unhappy, right? And you might have heard that there's a senator in the US who has complained about this, even though the rules are not about Christians in particular, right? This is about all religions, and it is also about all sorts of non-religious activities. But their reaction is telling. And similarly, I actually went to the Greenpeace and Amnesty websites, and there are on their homepages, the landing pages, there are criticisms of these changes. And again, that tells you why, what is it that's causing them so much grief, right? As if they are so invested in India's development. I don't think anyone is. I don't think even our own government is that invested to be this disturbed. But they know that this will ask them to follow a certain standard and subject themselves to a certain scrutiny, which they have been so far been able to evade, right? So from a path to progress perspective, if you look at this legislation, it's a great. Well, firstly, it's strange that in 2026 that we didn't even have this, but better late than never. It's a great set of changes because it really tries to modernize and streamline our financial reporting and audit mechanisms when it comes to foreign funding. That's all it's trying to do, right? And then, of course, it's the country and its elected government's sovereign right to decide what's good and what's bad for the country, right? And like I said, actually the rules are very, very generous. So this whole idea that you can't do this, you can't do that is a bogey, right? There's very little limitation that's been put in place. You can basically do pretty much everything except those two exceptions that I mentioned, right? So it's a welcome set of changes which modernizes our regime. And like I said, the way money moves today is becoming more and more sophisticated, and it's very hard to track it. It's very hard to know who it came from, very hard to know who it's going to, etc. And so the law always needs to catch up with these sort of advancements in financial markets, but also the increasing sophistication via which bad actors utilize these advancements to their benefit and often to our detriment. So that's another remark I wanted to make. And I then want to just really close by talking about that whole proselytization point a little bit, right? And now this is a little bit of my sort of personal analysis and remarks. So I briefly mentioned that the government actually can't stop proselytization because propagation of religion is a fundamental right. Now, the Supreme Court has previously ruled that cannot be done in a manner that is relying on inducements, right? But you have to understand the people who are in this business of proselytization, they simply don't care because they genuinely believe that all their purpose on earth is to convert that person to a certain religion. And usually this tends to be the Baptists and the Pentecostal Christians. You don't see as much of this actually, even funnily, from the Islamic seminaries and the Catholics. They tend to be far more, let's just say, conservative in their efforts to spread their religious words and works. But certain church groups, mostly based in the US, are they're really nutcases when it comes to these activities. So we can't easily stop that given our constitution, right? But what we can do is we can basically say that you can't get this money to do that, because that is very much within the government's control. They can stop the flow of money for any reason. So they're trying to stifle proselytization by the only mean that is available to them, which is actually stifling the funding that's coming in. Now, I would go further than this, right? And this government has the distinction of being criticized for things that it's not even done, right? And this is why I jokingly say that might as well do it, because you're actually facing flack for something you've not done. So I don't think that this regulation and our regulations in general go far enough from proselytization, right? If you believe that the fundamental character of this country should not be changed because the fundamental character, religious, social, ethnic, and linguistic, is tied to the national interest and to the unity of the country, which, by the way, is a view shared by Nehru, shared by Gandhi, shared by Ambedkar, and shared by me, amongst many other people. Then we should be asking ourselves a much tougher question, which is, why should there be any kind of organized conversion? Because again, in a free society, it's very hard to say you can't convert at all. That would require some sort of a dictatorship or communism, right? So it's this idea of freedom of conscience, right? So if you as an adult want to do something, you can always do it, but it's very hard to ascertain this. And we don't have the resources to go and investigate every person who has indulged in some kind of conversion to figure out whether it was true conversion or forced conversion or induced conversion. This can't be a national priority. But I think as a national sort of safeguard and a basic principle, I think we should be challenging the norm around all kinds of conversion, whether induced or not induced. And this needs to be tied to this fundamental principle that history has shown again and again and again that wherever the civilizational link to, and I hate using this word, but to Hinduism or Hindu society has been broken, the country has been broken. Is it a coincidence that the Muslim-dominated parts of India were partitioned? No, it's not a coincidence. Is it a coincidence that Kashmir, or at least a part of it, wanted to secede? No, it's not a coincidence. Is it a coincidence that in Northeast India there have been decades of insurgency, especially in Nagaland and Mizoram, which both are 90+% Christian? No, it's not a coincidence. And I can go on and on with other examples, right? Including in Punjab with Khalistan, etc., which is sadly, but again, another example of what happens when there's too much of a deviation from our civilizational, and I just to put it bluntly, from our Hindu heritage. So this law does not do that. I think this law recognizes that's a problem. This law tries to stifle it, at least from foreign funded sources. But for example, all this is saying is that you cannot proselytize using foreign money, which means if I, as an Indian, give you money, you can actually proselytize. Very important. It cannot stop you from doing that because of the constitutional guarantees and because of how hard it is to prove that it was done through inducements and money. So anyway, this is my sort of end-to-end analysis of both the legislation and the rules, but also a few remarks that I wanted to share on this one question around proselytization and why this actually does not do what it's being accused of doing to any great deal. And that's a topic that we should talk about separately. But hopefully this was useful. And if it was, let me know. If you have any questions, let me know. And if you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Thank you.